For most individuals who have spent some time in the deep woods, there seems to be a collective feeling. For some, it's a slight uneasiness when darkness begins to descend upon the tall trees. For others, it's a core-shaking fear that can make it almost unbearable to be away from civilization. The faint hoot of an owl or the rustle of the wind through a bush might be enough to make us flinch. For a majority of people, this fear of something horrible perspiring out in the deep woods has never come true. But for some unlucky individuals, a night among the trees has turned into an episode of horror. These are 4 true deep woods horror stories. Before I begin, a quick warning. This video contains topics of real horror and violence, so viewer discretion is advised. The year is 1969. 6-year-old Dennis Martin and his family set off on their annual camping trip out in the pristine Smoky Mountains. For those who don't know, the Smoky Mountains are a mountain range in southeastern United States. It's characterized by a blue mist that tends to float above the peaks of the mountains and gives it a stunning yet eerie presence. Dennis's father Bill led him, his 9-year-old brother Doug, and the rest of the Martin family from the beautiful Caddis Cove Valley to Russell Field, a highland meadow where they planned to spend the night. Dennis, or Denny as his family called him, was described as a, quote, small but strong kid. He was a fearless little kid that never had any trouble keeping up with his dad on the trails. On Saturday morning after breakfast, the group hiked further up the mountain to the gorgeous Spence Field, an area known for its breathtaking views. The group had lunch and the kids played while the parents talked about the trip. On the side, the young Martin kids put a plan together to scare the parents. They huddled up and whispered to each other the plan. Then they all took off into the bushes. After a few minutes of sneaking, the kids lunged out at the parents and all let out their loudest shriek. The group all had a good laugh about it, but suddenly Dennis's dad had a realization. Where was Dennis? He was wearing a bright red shirt, so he should be easy to spot out in the green terrain. The group began to call out for Dennis, but to no avail. What was a light-hearted, fun-filled weekend away with the family now turned into a moment of panic for everyone. The group immediately split into the nearby trails and began to search for Dennis. Then 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3, then 4. Despite their pleads and calls for Dennis, he never emerged or even made a sound within the forest. On top of this, a large thunderstorm began to roll in, and within minutes, the family had to seek shelter. According to sources, 3 inches of rain fell that day, and the downpour made it nearly impossible to hear anything outside their nearby surroundings. So even if Dennis was calling for his family, there was no way for them to hear. A massive search ensued the next morning, with over 240 people scouring over the scene and nearby areas. However, the flooded terrain made it incredibly difficult to get an efficient search going. Trails had been washed out from the storm, and this made the prospect of finding tracks quite unlikely. Despite this effort, Dennis Martin still has not been found to this day. This case made national headlines, with President Richard Nixon claiming he would aid in the search efforts. Some search experts familiar with the trails blame the mass amount of people and vehicles utilized to find Dennis as the reason as to why the search became hopeless, saying that possible tracks and evidence were covered up from tires and under the search team's footprints. To this day, investigators are still baffled on how a child could simply vanish a few feet away from his family. Some have proposed theories that he had been kidnapped. Others claim a wild animal such as a bobcat might have taken the poor child. The theories go on, but unfortunately, we will likely never know what happened to Dennis. This is a depiction of what Dennis Martin would look like today. In the year of 1959, an unexplained disaster would occur in the deep parts of the Ural Mountains in Russia. The violent and extremely gruesome nature of this disaster would leave many shocked even to this very day. To give some background on the event, a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov from the Ural Polytechnical Institute would form a skiing group. It was composed of 10 members, each of which had a certification skiing level of grade 2. And to put this in context, during this time the Soviet Union's max grade for skiers was grade 3, and most were fellow students from the university. The plan was that the group would embark on a skiing trip from Vizhai, a small town in western Russia, and eventually reach the end goal of the Otorten Mountain. The whole trip took months of planning and would span over 250 miles of pristine mountainous terrain. The trip was also approved by several well-established skiers over the course of the planning phase, so this was by no means a rushed venture. They began their journey on January 27, 1959, but within one day, a member of the group named Yuri would have to turn back due to a heart effect that prevented him from going any further. On January 31st, 4 days after the start of their hike, they had made good time and prepared to enter the highland area of the journey. At some point during their hike, a massive snowstorm struck and made it incredibly difficult for the group to see where they were going. As a result, instead of heading north as they should, they instead began to head west, towards Kolatchiakal, or the Dead Mountain. It's here that the group decided to set up camp and not risk getting lost again. This would be the last confirmed information we have on the group from diary entries. Prior to the trip, it was agreed upon that Igor would send a telegram back to the club once they had arrived back at their starting point. The designated time for that was February 12th, but Igor had warned that it may be later. Then on February 12th, the club back at Ural University had received nothing. This wasn't an immediate cause for concern, as it was highly likely that the group was going to arrive late of their deadline. Then another day passed, then another, then another. On the 20th of February, 8 days after their estimated arrival time, and nearly a month after they had left on their venture, a rescue party was sent to look for the group. 6 days later, searchers discovered an abandoned and badly destroyed tent on the Kolat Mountain. The tent had been torn apart and all of the group's belongings were still inside, including items like shoes and clothes. The searchers found 9 trails of footprints, most going barefoot or wearing socks, wandering away from the campsite. The trail led about a mile away from the campsite until eventually reaching the edge of a wooded area. Searchers then found the remains of a small fire under a tree, with the remains of 2 people dressed in only their underwear. 3 more corpses were found between the campsite and the trees, including Igor's body. All these individuals were identified having died of hypothermia, but that still left 4 unaccounted for bodies. It would take rescuers another 2 months to locate the remaining bodies, but what they found would be the catalyst to all the unsolved and mysterious stigma behind this incident. The remaining 4 were found further into the forest, but 3 of these bodies were different. They had more clothes on than the others. One of them had major skull damage, and the other 2 had major chest fractures. According to the mortician, in order to have suffered these injuries, these 3 would have likely had to suffer extreme amounts of pressure, similar to that of a car crash. Some had missing body parts as well. People were quick to blame the indigenous Mansi people who lived there around these areas, but these were quickly disproven given the lack of any other tracks. Some were quick to say that an avalanche was the cause of the group's demise, that the loud sound caused the group to panic, thinking that they were about to be consumed by a fleet of snow. Desperately, they ran across the mountain to seek shelter under the trees, and that accounts for the massive wounds 3 of them suffered during the chaos, as they were hit by falling ice. This sounds like a fairly sound theory. However, no evidence of an avalanche was ever found, leaving this explanation very questionable. And over 100 expeditions on the mountain have claimed that they've never once seen any evidence that there may be an avalanche. To this very day, we still do not know the cause of the demise of those 9 hikers way out in the wilderness. Glen Hyde was born on December 9, 1898, in Twin Falls, Idaho. Glen lived a rather quiet life as a farmer, but got his fair share of excitement from his family's business. Glen's dad managed the Snake River in Idaho, and as a result, Glen became skilled in piloting a type of boat called a scow. Scows are a smaller sailboat typically used for coastal or river racing. Meanwhile, Bessie Haley was born on December 29, 1905, in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Bessie also lived a, quote, adventurous life out in the rural parts of her state, but there doesn't seem to be much information on what this entailed. Bessie's life would take a difficult turn in her young adult years, after she married a man named Earl Hemlock. The two would quickly fall apart, and as a result, Bessie would ask for a divorce. This may not seem like such a big deal in the 21st century, but in the early 1900s, divorces were nearly unheard of. In 1920, the divorce rates were roughly 12 out of every 1,000 marriages. To avoid unneeded drama in her small town, Bessie decided she wanted a change of pace and moved out to San Francisco, despite still being married to her husband. It was out in California that Glen and Bessie would meet and change the course of their life. During a charter boat from San Fran to LA, the two of them would spark interest in each other. Then in 1928, Bessie would divorce her husband Earl and marry Glen Hyde. For most during this time, a quiet getaway with some relaxation would be a perfect honeymoon. But Earl and Bessie were a different cut, and wanted something a bit more extreme. Earl pitched the idea of building their own scow or sailboat to take down the Colorado River. The plan was the two of them would start their journey at Green River, Utah, trek through the Colorado River Rapids in the Grand Canyon, and end at Needles, California. A journey from Green River to Needles, California, by river, had never been done before. And once Bessie agreed to the idea, Glen began to get ideas of making history with the likes of Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh. So, with the help of some engineers, Glen and Bessie built a boat called Rain in the Face and headed off on their expedition. On October 20th, 1928, the couple headed off on their honeymoon trip. Initially, the group made good time. It was reported that they passed through Soap Creek in record time. Glen was attempting to set a world record for the fastest trip through the Grand Canyon. Then nearly a month later, on November 18th, the two were spotted going through the Hermit Rapid, a well-known whitewater rapid segment. Little did everyone know this would be the last time Glen and Bessie were ever seen. Somewhere between Hermit River and their endpoint of Needles, California, the two vanished. It was a long stretch of wilderness that would not be easy to search over, especially in 1928 without the access of helicopters and other vital search equipment. Glen's father, presuming something was wrong, launched a search party 2 days before December 9th, their estimated arrival date. Prior to the disappearance, the couple decided to hire professional photographer Emery Kolb. Kolb had been around the river for over 20 years, and that was one of the last people to ever see the couple alive. During an interview with Kolb, he stated that he told the couple just how dangerous their boat looked. He said that Bessie looked tired and over the whole journey with the numerous amount of repairs it required. Kolb even offered the two a place to stay in his cabin. Glen denied this request and told them that they'd be continuing down the river. For weeks, search parties scoured the river, and on December 19th, an Army observation plane spotted the boat drifting around River Mile 237. A rescue team was immediately sent, but once they arrived, confusion set in. Initially, the obvious answer seemed that the boat overturned and the two fell out. But upon investigation, the boat showed no signs of overturning, and all their equipment was still packed in. Along the river, there were no signs of footprints, and no bodies ever washed up. To this very day, no one knows what happened to the two. Some claim that one murdered the other, others claim that Bessie's ex-husband murdered them, and others simply believe that they were somehow victims of the river. Many theories have been proposed, but none have been confirmed. At this point, it's unlikely that we will ever know what happened to that couple drifting down the river. Brad Treat was a 38-year-old U.S. Forest officer. Brad was described as an avid outdoorsman who enjoyed spending lots of his free time among the pines of Glacier National Park in Montana. According to his wife, Brad would jog on the nearby trails every morning with her and would typically mountain bike around 5 to 6 days during the week in his free time. Not only was Brad an avid mountain biker, but he was also extremely competitive one at that. His friends claimed that Brad would ride around at 20 to 25 miles per hour through the mountain biking trails. And while that might not seem like a lot for street biking, when you have to navigate roots, rocks, and other obstacles on the trail, that number seems more impressive. It was on June 29th, 2016, in a smaller park south of Glacier named Flathead National Park, that Brad would meet a horrible encounter. Brad was out riding on the mountain bike trails with a friend. The two were enjoying the day as they rode on down the path of the Green Gate trails. Around 1:30 p.m., something would turn the course of that entire day. As Brad was turning a corner at his normal 25 miles an hour speed, he suddenly collided with a large obstacle. Brad immediately went over his handlebars and shattered both of his wrists upon impact. His friend behind him had heard the sound of Brad hitting the ground, followed by a deep and guttural whimper sound from a creature. As his friend turned the corner, he could see Brad had collided with a massive grizzly bear. It seemed as if this blind curve prevented Brad from seeing the dangers ahead. The companion stood in shock as the bear completely dismissed him and made his way over to Brad. According to his friend, the bear wanted nothing to do with him and was only focused on the now exposed Brad. The bear immediately began to attack Brad, and not knowing what to do, his companion turned around to go get help. His friend would have to bushwhack through roughly 1 mile of wooded terrain until he finally reached the highway. But as many of you can probably assume, at that point it was too late. Upon arriving at the scene, Brad was already deceased, and most of his remains had been consumed by the bear. This incredibly sad and heartbreaking fate led to a new set of guidelines when it came to safe travels in the park. And to this day, people are still shocked on Brad Treat's death that fateful day. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. We just hit 100 subscribers, and I can't thank all of you enough for the support. Have a great day. Goodbye.